Nerds. Coming to you on a Tuesday, you say? Well, yes, I am. That's because today is the very first episode of a new video series called What's the Deal With... ... Exciting, yes? Today I'm going to be talking about audio terminology. What is the deal with it? There are sort of a lot of words that folks kind of throw around when talking about the qualities of different pieces of gear. So today I'm going to dive right into it. Before we do get into the topic, there are a couple of kind of key things that you need to know about in order to kind of understand, just so that we're on the same page. And you probably already know what these things are, but I'm just going to mention them here. First is frequency response, frequency range. This refers to the frequencies that a device, a system, an audio system can reproduce. And typically, the human range of hearing is 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. And, but I will say that frequencies below and above that can affect frequencies within that range that we do hear. So if earphone or headphone, for example, goes up to 40 kilohertz, you might say, that doesn't matter. I don't need all those extra hertz. I don't need all those extra frequencies. But the truth is that these things are sort of harmonically and mathematically related to the stuff that falls within our human range of hearing. So it can actually sort of change the way that we perceive those things. And the next little tidbit of, the next little definition that you got to be aware of is transient response, which refers to the way that a system can reproduce a sudden peak in energy, in audio energy. Can it reproduce, can the speaker move at the exact time that a hit occurs, for example? It's sort of perceived in different ways, and actually transient response is a lot of times manipulated by mix engineers to change the way that different instruments sort of sound and impact the rest of the song. So it's sort of an important piece of information to be aware of. So what is audio terminology? Articulating the sensations that we experience when we listen to things is really hard. And not only is it hard to articulate to oneself when you're listening, but it's also even harder really to articulate these things so that someone else can sort of understand it and wrap their heads around it. My experience with this terminology has been less of a mastery of just memorizing things, and more so sort of an acceptance of the adaptation that is going to have to go along with learning these words. It's kind of through communicating with peers and professionals and mentors that this language sort of adapts and changes and becomes part of the vocabulary when trying to describe something. There are a few words that really come up time and time again, really, when talking specifically about audiophile things, pieces of gear and music and stuff. And because of just being around folks that are using these words and, this kind of becoming a normal piece of my vocabulary when I try to communicate, sometimes it comes across as a little bit of like a jargon, like gobbledygook of words that isn't so easy to understand to somebody who's newer to it or to someone who's not so technical. So there are a few words that I want to go through with you today, just to sort of clear the air, make a little bit of sense out of things, and hopefully this will help when it comes to trying to determine for yourself whether or not a piece of gear is right for you. So number one is boost and cut. When I describe the sound signature of a pair of headphones, for example, sometimes you'll hear me refer to a boost or a cut, and this refers to the relative levels of frequencies in that device. So say, for example, you've got a headphone that is really bass heavy, it's a bass headphone. I might communicate that as saying it has a boosted bass, or a bass boost. And this actually kind of stems from my time working with music as a mix engineer and as an audio engineer, where I have an EQ and I'm making decisions to manipulate the sound to shape what I want it to be. Likewise, for example, if a headphone has more of like a smiley face curve, or, well, I guess that's another piece of audiophile terminology, which basically means it's got boosted lows, right, and boosted highs. I might describe that as having a mid-range cut, because the mid-range, in comparison to the lows and the highs, is lower. It's cut a little bit. And yes, it's the same terminology that we use in the audio professional world when we're making EQ moves. If I need to, say for example, I'm recording an acoustic guitar, right? And it's sounding a little bit like there's too much bass in the acoustic guitar. I might make a low-end cut, but I really also want to hear some of the finger noise, so then I might boost some of the highs to get some of that fret noise and some of that finger noise. So the terms boost and cut really are actually talking about sound manipulation, and that's sort of how I think of headphones and the way that I think of speakers in general, is that they're sort of the way that the song, the file, however you want to think about it, the actual source is, and that gets a little bit manipulated when it goes through this headphone, when it goes through the speaker. The speaker and the headphone has its effect on the sound, and I guess, how do I describe this? When there's a sound that's, a headphone, for example, that's really neutral, that is a sound signature in itself. So it's worth mentioning boost and cut anyway, because it is always a manipulation. Next is dark and bright. Darkness, brightness. Now, darkness and brightness refers to the amount of high-frequency information. So as you might imagine, something that's very bright has a lot of high-frequency information. Something that's pretty dark has not as much high-frequency information. Let's do a little thought experiment for a second. Imagine you've got a camera, and you can adjust the settings, the aperture maybe on the camera, to let in lots of light so that the image is very overexposed, or you can kind of adjust it so that it doesn't let in very much light at all. It's sort of shrouded in shadows. Now, this is sometimes used as an artistic choice. Something that is shrouded in shadows maybe has sort of a mysterious kind of feel to it. Or maybe something that's really overexposed has sort of an extremity, this feeling of extremity and intensity to it that just a normal picture wouldn't have. So sometimes it's used as an artistic choice in audiophile land as well. Something that really has like an extended and boosted high end can kind of bring out details that you wouldn't hear necessarily. But something else that has like less highs, maybe it's trying to emphasize something else, or sort of have a mark on the music that's a little bit different, a little bit more like, well, I don't want to use any more audiophile terminology just yet, but I think you get the point. Sometimes it's used as an artistic choice, and sometimes it feels like a mistake. And so talking about brightness and darkness in reviews when I'm talking about headphones or something like that is mostly, me trying to determine, was this a mistake? Was this a choice? And, is it well done or not? And that part of it is pretty subjective, honestly. But, that's sort of something that you can learn for yourself. What do you actually prefer in these types of products? Do you prefer something that has a brighter or darker sound signature? And sort of along the same lines as darkness and brightness, I really want to talk about the word warmth. It's sort of a controversial word, to be honest with you. I hear people sort of use it in different ways, and I guess that's the nature of language, isn't it? That sometimes it doesn't necessarily it's not like a measurable characteristic. So its meaning can sort of shift and change from person to person. But I will describe for you how I use the word warmth and what I mean by it. To me, warmth is a combination of sort of a darker sound signature and a smooth and slower kind of transient response. So when a hit happens, it's not so, the headphones, for example, aren't so reactive that it has a lot of movement. Rather, it's sort of syrupy and smooth. This is also subjective, and I'm sorry for using terminology to describe other terminology, but yeah, I hope you get the point. But for example, let's think back to the camera analogy, right? So you have a photo that is dark, for lack of better words. You know, it's not overly exposed, it's actually a little bit underexposed. So there's definitely, you lose a little bit of details in the shadows, but it still has some light accents, accents little certain pieces of the picture, right? Now, if I were to take that same photo and take a contrast tool and bump the contrast way up, there would be a really big difference between the bright parts and the dark parts. It'd almost probably look somewhat comic-like, not realistic at all, and definitely an effect. Likewise, if I were to take that same contrast tool and move it all the way down to the point where, you know, the difference between the lightest and the darkest parts isn't very different at all, that to me is where warmth is. So warm is this combination of having sort of a darkish signature that has this sense of like smoothness and homogeny and similarity. Now this can also, just like darkness and brightness, be good or bad, and it sort of depends on a lot of things. It really depends on the rest of the characteristics of the piece of gear. And I think that sometimes it can be used as a choice, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just sort of something that's overlooked. But I will say, okay, one example that you might be aware of that has a warm tone is old sort of analog gear. Think of a record player or, you know, a band that's recorded their album to tape, for example. There's sort of this sense of, you know, these tools sometimes give it like an older kind of sound, and a warm sound, and I think that's one way that you can maybe sort of think about it or have something to compare it to when you're trying to determine for yourself whether or not you want a pair of headphones that someone describes as being warm. The next words are thick and thin. Thickness and thinness, to me, refers to the presence of low mid-range energy, low mid-range frequency information of a listening device. If you're listening to a pair of headphones, for example, that has a lot of low mid-frequency information, you might sort of experience this as a sense of thickness or fullness or body. These words all sort of mean sort of the same thing. And similarly, thinness refers to the lack of low mid-frequency information. So sort of the most relatable thing I can think of that is something that's thin is, imagine your best friend's voice, your partner's voice, whatever, talking to you live in the room, right? Now imagine that same person's voice over the telephone. Over the telephone, there is no low-mid frequency information. It's a really, really narrow band of frequencies that come through over the telephone, and so this feels really thin. It doesn't have much body. It feels somewhat fragile, somewhat weak. It can come through, but at the same time, while it's sort of maybe a little bit fragile and weak, it can still sort of poke through, very easily heard, for lack of better words. And this is used a lot of times as a tool for mixing. Think of a common instrument, the electric guitar. If you have a thick electric guitar, imagine what that might sound like. It'll be a heavy electric guitar, something that drives a lot of power home. Or it can make things really muddy, sort of depending on the context of what we're talking about. Likewise, think of a soloing electric guitar. There might not be as much body there. In fact, it might actually be relatively thin compared to the big electric guitars that are trying to support it. But that soloed, thin electric guitar pokes through. You can really hear it, and it comes forward in the mix. It takes a little bit of a step toward you when that solo comes in. And again, thickness and thinness, just like everything else, can be used as an aesthetic tool, but it can also be something that's overlooked and can harm the quality of a pair of headphones, I think. But anyways, thanks for watching, and are there any words that you're curious about, or are there any words that you like to use when you're describing headphones? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to do my best to try and answer them. Also, if you have any more suggestions for topics for What's the Deal with ... episodes, feel free to leave some suggestions down below. And thanks for watching. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, and for more videos like this, I'll be posting them every Tuesday, so feel free to subscribe. Alright, I'll see you next time.